the peer group thought had the most cogent analysis and pre-warning of the approaching financial crisis. So Nouriel Roubini was one of the people who was considered for this, and various others. And the peer group actually elected Steve Keen by a wide margin as the winner of the Revere Award. That's not generally known. Forgot to mention, just wanted to throw it in as you're getting in the topic.
Okay, thank you. Okay. And again, same sort of arguments coming from Greenspan. It isn't just the leading academics, also propositions that we've shown the experience of the last, in Greenspan ratings 2006, published in 2007, that the experience has shown that the economy moves smoothly from one state of equilibrium to another, and that really free trading following your own self-interest leads to a growing, most important word from my point of view, they're stable economy. Well, that's not something I think we'd be saying at the moment. And equally, in looking at the development of macroeconomic theory, this is Olivia Blanchard, who most of you would know as the founding editor of the American Economic Review Macro sub-journal, and of course IMF chief economist as well, and talking about the contest between the neoclassicals and new Keynesians, the developing of DSGE modelling, largely claiming the victory of the new Keynesian group, and saying largely because facts don't have a habit of not going away, the shared vision has emerged of fluctuations in methodology. Everything is fine, nothing is deadly, the state of macro is good. Now, I've chosen when it was published as a journal paper, but that was first posted as a working paper on the 13th of August 2008, which is roughly 1 year and 6 days precisely after we now record the start of the crisis, which was the collapse of the BNP funds linked to the subprime market in America. So I think the tune has changed afterwards, but a large part of that, and this is Blanchard again, trying to explain what happened, saying, well, basically the economy is hit by an extremely large exogenous shock. And that exogenous shock came from the financial sector, but it could have been a pandemic or a major terrorist attack, etc., etc. So really interpreting the disturbance as being the system still in equilibrium, hit by an extremely large shock. And this is a paper by Ireland, again the same sort of argument. The Great Recession began with a series of adverse preference and technology shocks, roughly the same as previous crises. However, they then grew and became larger in magnitude, but still remaining negative, which explains the shock and the length of the recession. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of Robert Solow, pretty much a sole campaign trying to overturn DSGE modelling, which he's been doing since 2001. But in 2003 he made this observation on if that's how you try to handle the pathology like a deep recession, saying it's in equilibrium hit by an exogenous shock, quite honestly says, why should reasonable people accept this as an explanation? So that's, to me, I think DSGE modelling has got itself in a complete impasse. And I spent plenty of time in the new edition of Debunking Economics talking about why. What I'll talk about today is an alternative credit-based macroeconomic model. And a major part of explaining why it matters when I'm talking to a neoclassical, really trained economist, or really many branches of economics, is why you've got to look at aggregate debt and the volume of debt and change in aggregate debt, not just the distribution of debt in macroeconomics. And I'm going to start at a very informal level. I often give this presentation to non-academics and I build up later. I jump in very rapidly here. And most people accept that if you have two sources of your own spending. You can either spend from your income or you can increase your debt. Those are the two basic levels that individuals have in a credit-based system. And when you look at how neoclassical theory, and most economic theories in general, that still haven't quite got to the stage of a proper credit model, count the first, ignore the second. And the proposition pretty much is that, and this is quoting from Krugman's 2010 paper with Egerton, the Kuh, Minsky, Fisher model of the crisis, saying, if you ignore the foreign component, looking at the world as a whole, the overall level of debt makes no difference to aggregate net worth. One person's assets, another person's liability, cancel the two out, you don't need to worry about debt. And then in putting his model together, since you say the level of debt doesn't matter, the only way debt can matter is by the distribution of debt. So he builds a new Keynesian two individual model where one's an impatient agent, the other's a patient agent, and the patient lends to the impatient. And that gives you a model like this where it says, well, what's actually going on? There's a patient person who saved a lot of money, there's an impatient person who has none, and what happens when a loan is created is spending power from the patient agent goes to the impatient, so you have an increase in the patient's spending power goes down, there's an increase in the impatient agents, unless there's a huge difference in distribution between the two, consumption behaviour between the two, there's no great change in aggregate demand, so you can basically drop debt out of the analysis, and you ignore banks as well because they're just intermediaries. That's all the only role they're playing. That's the conventional vision. Now, from the endogenous money point of view, it isn't a case of transferring spending power from a saver to a borrower. I don't know how many of you have read work like by Basil Moore and people of that nature on endogenous money, but I actually want to go back much earlier and talk about Joseph Schumpeter, because when you hear people saying things like banks create money out of nothing, it sounds like the sort of thing an amateur would say. Well, whatever else Joseph Schumpeter was, he's no amateur. And he talks about this proposition, do you finance investment by transferring spending power from a saver to an investor, borrower, or do you create it by the banks endogenously expanding spending power? And he said, well, the first explanation, which dominates the profession back then and still today, is not obviously absurd. Okay? But he says it's minor, completely minor, compared to the actual way of doing it, which is banks creating purchasing power out of nothing. And he literally uses that phrase. That they're not a case of transferring existing purchasing power from one person to another, but generating new purchasing power out of nothing. So that change in debt adds to aggregate demand. And that's a perspective you can find running through not just Schumpeter but Marx as well, Minsky and Fisher. And that's the sort of work in which I've been building my models for the last 20 years or so. And again, empirical research supports. So one of the best papers on this is actually written by then Vice President of Research for the Federal Reserve in New York, Alan Holmes, right in '69, in a paper where he was trying to block the move to monetarism and making a very practical argument that monetarist theory does not work or will not work because they've got the mechanism of money creation completely back to front. The banks don't need reserves to lend. I'll give you a quote from him later. Of all people, Kidlin and Prescott conclude the very, very good empirical paper by arguing that bringing credit into economic theory in a way that accounts for not just financial fluctuations but real fluctuations as well is an important open question in economic theory. Now, it's not an open question they addressed, but they admitted that the dynamics they got contradicted the neoclassical belief that fluctuations in the money supply should only have monetary effects and not have real effects. They found quite the contrary. Basil Moore is the economist who did the most to bring in endogenous money working as a post-Keynesian but doing very strongly empirically based work, arguing the money supply expands exogenously. And there's a series of papers by Basil that are well worth reviewing to see the degree of argument behind this endogenous money perspective. I've got those all as references at the end, and I'm very happily going to put the whole lot of slides up there, so if you want to take notes if you like, but I'm certainly going to give everybody a copy of this through whatever email is necessary to do that. So my emphasis comes from Hyman Minsky's work, which of course is also in this endogenous money tradition, and that's, he said, if you're going to have a model of capitalism, it must be something which can generate a depression, for the simple empirical reason that depressions have happened in the past. He said it happened in the past. When he wrote this paper in '82, it hadn't happened for 40 years or so, but it did happen, and he said, question then is, how did we avoid it? How did it happen in the first place? Have we avoided it for the last 35 years? And he said to answer those questions, we have to have an economic theory which makes Great Depressions one of the possible states of the system. And fundamentally what he's arguing is if you have a model which can't generate a Great Depression, then you haven't got a model of capitalism. And that rules out, of course, DSG modelling. Now, he did that. At the time he wrote this, of course, the ISLM model was dominant, but I'd argue the same proposition applies there, even though you can generate a pathology with ISLM that you can't with DSGE. It still fundamentally doesn't reach the answer that Minsky wants, because again here he's saying with the neoclassical things that there's capital assets, financial arrangements, money creation, liabilities and uncertainty are all assumed away. And that applies to ISLM just as much as it does to DSGE. So he's saying we've got to do better than that. Now Minsky did actually develop a mathematical model in his PhD, published in '57, but he used Hicks's trade cycle model, Hicks-Hansen-Samuelson trade cycle model. And I argued elsewhere that that's economically mathematically okay but economically invalid model. And I'll go into that later if you want to go into discussion. So he never got anywhere with it. But he did develop the verbal argument over time when he became exposed to the main inspirations by the time he wrote his thesis were Fisher and Schumpeter. He didn't know anything of Keynes. He later then read Keynes's 1937 paper, The General Theory of Employment, and then realised that Keynes was not ISLM. And the final development was reading actually Koleski's work as well, The Principle of Increasing Risk, which was a major part of his 1957 work. But he finally got this thesis together by the late 60s, early 70s. And it starts with an economy in historical time. And both those are important. Of course, we leave those both of those are left out of most economic models, both history and time. But he says if you're in historical time, there's been a debt-induced recession in the recent past. So we can choose 1990 as our reference point. Say we're talking about the economy in 93, 94. Because of that crisis, both borrowers and lenders are very wary of the level of debt they'll get into. And this is not asymmetric information. This is shared expectations about an uncertain future. So the asymmetric interpretation is not correct. If you read Minsky, you can't find asymmetry as a major argument there. What you find is symmetry of expectations. So because the economy's recovered, we've got conservative projects, the only ones that are put forward at this stage, but because the economy's recovered, most of those projects succeed. And that therefore means that investors and banks both think they were too conservative last time round. If they'd been more highly levered, they would have made more money. So the accepted ratio of debt to equity rises, and they start also to value assets more highly. This is a model which integrates the goods market with the assets market, which again is different to neoclassical thinking. And Minsky has a classic phrase, there's only a 13-word sentence, I've taken 3 of them out: stability is destabilising. He argues that stability in a capitalist economy with an uncertain future and sophisticated financial institutions is destabilising because it leads to expectations changing. So equilibrium, a period of tranquility, which is unusual in a capitalist economy, leads to rising expectations. You've got an instant destabilising force at the heart of the model. Now for a while that's a positive effect because with self-fulfilling expectations setting in, you invest more, the economy grows faster, which validates part of the investment. And you also start getting the growth in asset prices as well. And Minsky uses this phrase, the Euphoric Economy, to describe the phase where you've got past the fear of the last crisis, rising expectations have set in, and ultimately people get to a virtually euphoric state. And the number of times I've seen that word used to describe various periods in the economy in the financial press is remarkable. It'd be an interesting literary economics thesis to track the word of the use of euphoric in the financial press. So with that period you have rising asset prices, so you can speculate profitably on those prices, and the willingness to lend increases the money supply, lend and borrow. That's the endogenous expansion of the money supply going on there, which enables riskier investments, and it also enables asset speculation and finances asset speculation, giving rise to the major actor that Minsky introduces into economics, which is the Ponzi financier. And years ago I had to explain who Charles Ponzi was. I know I don't anymore, correct? It's become part of the language now. So they, in Minsky's terms, are entrepreneurs of some description who have a cash flow that's less than their debt servicing costs. So the only way they can actually profit is by selling assets on a rising market. But before they do that, they have a continuous demand for money because they are losing money. If they actually didn't have any more debt, ultimately they'd exhaust their cash flow. Their cash flow out would exhaust their cash reserves. They've got a desperate demand for rising debt, and they therefore can drive up market interest rates at the same time. So ultimately you've got rising debt levels. You have many projects which are fundamentally losing money in a cash flow sense, and rising interest rates as well. One of those 3 will push you into a crisis because some of those conservatively estimated projects done by real entrepreneurs start looking a bit speculative. So those investors can enter into the market selling into what they think is a broad market, and it's not a broad market. The asset market can collapse very easily, as we're seeing again right now. So the market floods, that increase in prices falters, and that's the end of the Ponzi's. Because as soon as that happens, if they have any debt to roll over whatsoever, they fold. My favourite Ponzi is actually something you haven't probably heard of, called Laurie Connell, who was an Australian Ponzi financier in Western Australia. He went bankrupt the day after the 1987 stock market crash. He was then rescued by other Ponzi financiers and kept on going until he spent the remainder of his years learning how to paint in Her Majesty's service. But they can't sell assets for a profit. Their debt servicing costs exceed their cash flows. There's a collapse in asset prices. The expansion of money supply goes into reverse. Investment evaporates, and you're back where you started again. So it's a cyclical model. But you started with a high level of debt because, again, this gives you a process where people are borrowing money during a boom, having to repay it during a slump. They have less cash flow than they expect to have. They don't pay it down quite so much. But when the economy starts to recover again, that same euphoric process starts over once more. So you ratchet up from a period of, you have a period of cycles where the debt level ratchets higher and higher, and you have a final crisis where the debt level simply overwhelms the economy's capacity to service that debt, and you go into a Great Depression. Now, I built a model of this back in my PhD thesis, building on Goodwin's growth cycle model. Is anybody here familiar with Goodwin's growth cycle model? Goodwin's a lousy writer. No wonder I couldn't follow it when I first tried to read his first paper. If you want to understand the model, get John Blatt's brilliant book, Dynamic Economic Systems, from 1983. Does a fantastic job of explaining this and a lot of other things in dynamic modelling. But it's a very simple model. It has capital determining output via an accelerator, and I'm going to build this in flowchart software as I go through. And that the output then determines the employment level when you divide output by labour productivity. You divide labour productivity by the level of the population and you've got the rate of employment. Feed that into a Phillips curve and you get the rate of change of wages. Integrate that and you get the level of wages, multiply it by labour and subtract it from output and you get the profit level. And in the simple model, all profits invested. So if you integrate profit, you get the level of, capital. And you tie the model back up again. That's a very simple dynamic model, which when you simulate it, gives you this sort of result. It's inherent cyclical. But rather than equilibrium, if you do your analysis of this technically, the dominant eigen, or the dominant eigenvalues in the system have got a real part of zero. So you get cycles, but you don't get convergence or divergence from that cycle. But not strictly a limit cycle in that sense, but it's a closed cycle. When you put the equations together, those are the two equations of the system. There's two system states, employment and wages share of output, which is really effectively its income distribution rather than just wages. And it's fundamentally a predator-prey model. That's the inspiration that Goodwin used to put the model together. Now, debts, I took that as a basis because you need a cyclical model, inherently cyclical model, to express the vision that Schumpeter and Minsky both had. But to bring in Minsky, you've got to bring in debt. And for debt to come in, you have to have somebody whose income is less than their borrowing needs at some point. So I have capitalists borrowing money when their expectations of profit are greater than the level of the expectations they have mean they want to invest more than their retained earnings. And again, I find it remarkable how often I find good empirical research by people who supported theories that I don't like. For example, CAP-M from Fama and French, but in doing some very good empirical work on the relationship between debt and finance, they said investment increases debt and higher earnings tend to reduce debt. Similar argument in another paper. That's very simply stated, saying the rate of change of debt is investment minus profits. So I added that to the Goodwin model, and once that was done, it's now a three-dimensional system where there's also a debt to output ratio as one of the three system states. And if I simulate that model, what you find is it's now, by going from 2 dimensions to 3 in continuous time, we've now gone to a system which can be chaotic. And the particular nature of chaos in this model is that the equilibrium is locally stable but globally unstable. So if you move too far away from the equilibrium, it ceases to exist and you therefore have a breakdown. And is known as the inverse tangent route to chaos. Now, that gives you sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. So if you start close to the equilibrium, then you get convergence. If you start further away, you get a breakdown. So the left-hand chart is showing employment and wages share clearly converge into equilibrium. The right hand, you can see they're clearly going the opposite direction. Their initial conditions determine the outcome. And behind that, and this is where the importance of debt comes in, it's the different dynamics of debt that explain those outcomes. The red line is the stable outcome, debt actually goes negative, meaning that capitalists are accumulating positive bank balances effectively. The blue, well, no need to comment on that. That's what we're going through to some extent at the moment. So I went on to concluding government as a homeostatic stabiliser in the paper I wrote in 1995. What I've been working on since then is trying to convert this from implicit money, because I've got debt but I don't actually have money stock or banks in any real way inside the system, converting it into a strictly monetary model. And that's combining the growth cycle I've shown you there, Minsky's thesis, which I've also included, and what's called a circuit theory of endogenous money creation. This is coming out of Europe. There's a particularly important researcher there called Graziani, Augusto Graziani. In my opinion, gave a brilliant explanation of why money matters in capitalism. And that was fundamentally that when you've got a monetary system, you're using promises to pay. You're not using a commodity. Money can't be modelled as the n+1 commodity in a narrative real world. You've got to treat it as a non-commodity. And he then made this brilliant insight that any monetary payment is therefore a triangular arrangement between three agents: the payer, the payee, and the bank. So you've got to include banks in your models, and that was to me a very important insight. Now, Graziani and friends did not have the capability to dynamic modelling. They spent 20 years caught in a stock flow confusion. It's fairly easy to solve that stock flow confusion, and I'll show you that in a moment. And what I've built out of that is a strictly monetary model. So my variables are not real anymore, they're monetary variables. If you want to work out the real ones, you've got to divide by the price level. And it's very simple to do, it's stunningly simple. But this is what you're modelling. With endogenous money creation, rather than the money multiplier argument, we're saying an entrepreneur approaches a bank for a loan. The bank says, okay, this is a loan, and you owe us money at the same time, exactly the same amount. So rather than having a time-lagged deposits create loans argument that's the money multiplier, you have a simultaneous creation of the asset and the liability of the banking sector. And that endogenous expansion comes out of that. And this is again quoting Alan Holmes on that front, writing back and trying to prevent the monetarist experience being tried in the first place. He said in the real world, banks extend credit, creating deposits in the process, and they look for the reserves later. The exact reverse of the causal mechanism in the money multiplier proposition. So those new loans put additional spending power into circulation, and I now want to show how you can model that. And it's incredibly simple. We simply steal something from the accountants. We haven't spoken to for about a century or so. About the time we started the dialogue, I think. And this is a very simple model of a 19th century banking sector where you've got a free banking system where they print notes. So they've got to have a vault out of which they pay money to the banks. So I'm modelling a strictly paper system here to get away from some other, what I see as pointless controversies in post-Keynesian literature. But what I have here is simply saying that the bank transfers notes from its reserves to the firm's deposit account, records the loan here, charges interest on it, the firm pays interest, the bank records that interest is paid, the firm pays wages to workers, workers consume and bankers consume. The firm then repays the loan by transferring it back to the vault. The bank records that it's been paid, and there's a new money creation to finance investment. Now, that's just a set of table entries. Normally people do arithmetic with that, but all you have to do is treat that as a system of differential equations instead. Add up the columns and you've got a system of system states. And I'll show you how that's, I first did that in MathCAD, where I first started doing this work. Just change to another window. Hang on, which one have I got? Yep. I'll just shut this one down. Actually, I better save the changes so I can show you how the symbolic processing works. It's loaded again. It's embarrassingly simple. That little 5-line symbolic program, I'll have people look at it later, takes a table like the one you can see here, which is the MathCAD version of that graphic I had in PowerPoint a moment ago. Make it a bit larger. Okay. And then symbolically converts that into a set of differential equations. So that table with substitutions made up earlier is now a system of differential equations that describe financial flows, strictly monetary financial flows. The reason I just developed this technique was I used to try to explain this to post-Keynesian economists. Forget it. I got what they call the Migo effect, my eyes glazed over. And one of them challenged me and said, you must have made mistakes in double entry bookkeeping terms. And I knew I hadn't, so I thought, I wonder if I can actually explain the equations using double entry bookkeeping, which is the first thing I did. And then I realised, in fact, I can actually generate them that way, using software like modern symbolic processing software like this. So that's what's done there. And I've linked it with the Minsky or Goodwin model by making a Phillips curve in money, as it was always supposed to be, and actually include the three factors Phillips actually spoke about as well, which were not just the level of employment, but its rate of change and inflation as well, were all arguments into his wage fixing system. Monetary profit as well, so profit is now price times quantity minus wages minus net interest payments. And of course a pricing equation is needed. And this was a surprise in working it out. I started from working from the absolutely simple constant parameters, constant money stock model, where I simply had physical output produced by labour and constant labour productivity. So output was just labour productivity times how many workers you hired, and constant money wage. And where the wage flow from firms is this expression. Now, I explained this in detail to my students, but I'll dive through here quickly here. 1 minus S is the worker's share of surplus. So total output of this economy goes into wages plus profits. Interest is just a transfer between groups. So that's workers' share. That's the time lag in going from financing production to selling the goods. So it's a production time, the length of time to go from money in, money back from selling output, and that's the amount of money in the firm's deposit account. So I started from that expression for saying that that's what wages are. So you can then say, well, labour is going to be that flow of money coming in divided by whatever the money wage is. So the actual number of workers is going to be that expression divided by your money wage. And physical output, on the other hand, is going to be labour multiplied by productivity. So you've got this expression for quantity. So multiply that through, I've now got an expression for an equilibrium quantity of output. Physical demand now is going to be the monetary flow of demand, and that's, again, what workers and capitalists are demanding, which is, in this case, that same expression, the amount of money in the firm's deposit account divided by the time lag, because the total sum of the workers is 1 minus S plus the S from the capitalists. It works out being the turnover in their firm's deposit account is the level of monetary demand in the economy. So you simply equate the two. There's your equilibrium physical demand and your equilibrium physical output. Go through and do some cancellations. They cancel and they cancel. And you're left with a Sraffian price equation, or a Koleskian Sraffian pricing equation. The price level is a markup, which is 1 over 1 minus S, well, that's the worker's share of output, multiplied by the monetary cost of producing a unit of output. So that's an equilibrium pricing equation. Add that in dynamically. Those are the 3 bits of it there. And what you've got effectively is prices are converting a physical surplus into a monetary one. And then for a dynamic equation, simply I've got a first order time lag convergence on that value. So I add that to the system as well. There's the rate of change of prices, there's a time lag in price setting, roughly a year, which is what empirical research implies that it is, on the equilibrium ship. So that all put together, I think it with a nonlinear investment function as well as the nonlinear responses by workers, and I've got nonlinear lending and debt repayment dynamics as well, and that pricing equation. And what I finally get, let's see, coming up here. Okay, is this monster. That's a system of 11 differential equations. So let's go across and see. Well, actually, I'll run it in, show you the output in MathCAD. Let's go across and take a look at that. So that's the entire output of the system down here. So just simulating the behavioural relationships. And then if I simulate what happens with the economy, this is now looking at level of real output. Something strange happens after a number of years. And what you get, and this is now looking at the actual American data, smoothing it out, so removing all the month-to-month fluctuation, putting it through a filter. You can see what neoclassical economics focused upon, the so-called great moderation, the decline in the level of inflation and unemployment, series of cycles all heading down, and then this happens out of the blue. What they're ignoring is the rising level of debt to GDP. I don't know how many of you know the actual stats there, but if I go back to 1945, the debt ratio in America was 45% of GDP. It peaked out at 300% in 2009.
Public and private both, right?
Pardon?
Public and private together?
No, just private debt.
Just private.
Yeah, private debt was actually heading down from about 140% after the war, down to about 60% or less before the crisis hit. This is an output from the model. I haven't attempted to calibrate in any way, just want to show the characteristics. And what you have is the same sort of what looks like stability coming along for a while, but you're actually in the same vortex that I showed in the three-dimensional model earlier, where rising debt is causing a crisis. But what I've got now happening as well is deflation, which I couldn't manage to get with the other model because I simply didn't have prices in there to begin with. So it's a coherent model which generates both the Great Moderation and the Great Depression as a potential output. And this model, of course, is good night Josephine to the economy because you don't have bankruptcy. Now, if I include that as well, you can recover. If we don't reduce the debt, we are going to be stuck in that sort of nightmare end session. That's the paper coming out in GIVO, hopefully later on this year or early next year. To continue beyond that, of course, that's still a stylized model because it's only single sectoral, but it actually works to extend to multi-sectoral dynamics. And the intriguing thing is that in putting, I have not kept up with that literature, but I've been told by the editor of the Journal of Input-Output Dynamics that they gave up on dynamic modelling. They couldn't get a dynamic input-output system. Well, you can if you put your input-output relations in the financial table when you've got a monetary system. And this is the same idea of that columnar layout to build a model with multiple sectors where the flows between the different sectors are now set by having to buy outputs off each other through the monetary system. So it's a ridiculously large model. What I'm now working on is, rather than showing it as a two-dimensional thing where it gets monstrous sideways, working with a three-dimensional hypercube. So the extra slices themselves become multiple sectors. And they're working on software to develop that right now. And what you get out of it is a multi-sectoral limit cycle. This is a genuine limit cycle, not like the stylized one in Goodwin's model. Those are cycles in the rate of profit in the four sectors. And you also get cycles in the actual level of output and level of debt, which, certainly in the case of the level of output, are very much like the stylized trade cycle. One thing that Galbraith was very strong on is saying the actual shape of the business cycle looks like a sawtooth. It's not symmetric. You have a long, slow boom and then a sudden, sharp decline. And that is an output of the model, the red line, and you've got a classic sawtooth shape coming out of it. So the very structure of the model seems to generate that behaviour that we also see in the real economy. And you get dynamics in the financial sector and income as well. So cycles and the level of unused reserves, like we're seeing right now, regularly repeated in the model. And you get further complex income distribution dynamics between the three social classes, workers, bankers and capitalists in the system. So now what I'm working on is producing tools to make this easier to do, because again, there's no problem asking a room of economists to learn software like this, but it's rather hard asking their students to learn it first off. So with a bit of help from some, as one of the people I've been corresponding on the web, a programmer, this software package has been written called QED, which enables you to replicate that same process by entering a table like the one I've got here. That table then generates a flow dynamic system. This is done as a tribute to Bill Phillips, where you can see the containers there are like Bill Phillips's old hydraulic computer from the 1950s, and you can then simulate it and see what happens to the accounts. And I've had my students build a model like that once they've been taught the software in a matter of about 10 minutes or so. I'd actually be teaching first year economics with a system like this. But that itself isn't good enough either, because it's not possible to really build production in that model. So what I'm working on is a software package which we're going by the trade name of Minsky, which is an attempt to simulate this sort of software. And this is engineering software, systems dynamics. This is the same model of Minsky that I showed you earlier, but now done in a flowchart system. And it's great for physical flows. It is appallingly difficult to build a financial flow model in this because the flowchart paradigm just doesn't work for physical flows. The flowchart paradigm works for physical flows, but not for financial. Financial flows are too complicated. There's too many points in which the same entry is made in a table. You get cables all over because these are all mathematical equations being passed around by cables. So it's the number of populations actually passing along this wire. If I right click, I think it'll actually show you the number at any particular point. That works brilliantly for physical flows. It's why engineers use it to design things like the Dreamliner, but it's not the right paradigm for financial analysis. So I'm getting a software package built that combines that tabular approach with an interface like that. And hopefully the first version of that will be ready by, I'd say, January or February of next year. That's being done with a grant from the George Soros Institute for New Economic Thinking. So that's an overview, and the book's got so much.